The harsh fluorescent lights of the boardroom reflected off the polished mahogany table, making the faces of the senior partners look pale and severe. Julian sat at the head, his expression impassive, as they droned on about a strategic merger, a union that required a personal commitment. He had been preparing to nod, to make the sacrifice for the corporation, when the heavy glass doors were thrown open with enough force to shutter the entire wall. Caleb stood there, still clad in his dusty racing jacket, a stark contrast to the sea of bespoke suits. The man who had been speaking, a portly executive named Mr. Henderson, trailed off mid-sentence, his jowls quivering. Caleb sauntered in, hooking a chair with his boot and spinning it around before leaning over Henderson's shoulder. He commented on Henderson's respectable vintage, musing aloud how a man of his experience might be perfect for a marriage alliance himself. The executive forced a laugh, his face bunching unpleasantly. Caleb's reputation as a reckless adrenaline junkie, the untamable younger brother of their CEO, preceded him. He was a menace they dared not cross. He perched casually on the edge of the conference table, legs swinging. He announced that if anyone felt the need to push Julian into an arranged match, they should come to him instead. He would be more than happy to pay their families a visit. The room emptied in a hurry, the partners scurrying away like frightened birds. Caleb had once sent a detailed report of a manager's illicit affairs directly to his notoriously litigious wife, an act that became a quiet legend within the company. When they were alone, Julian's silence was heavier than any shout. His brow was furrowed in deep disapproval. He ordered Caleb to kneel. A familiar ache blossomed in Caleb's chest, and he moved closer, sinking to his knees before his brother as he had done countless times before. Though Julian's face was a mask of control, Caleb knew him better than anyone. He was furious. Julian lit a cigarette, the smoke curling around his sharp features. He nudged Caleb's chest with the toe of his expensive shoe, telling him to kneel further away. The touch was light, but Caleb feigned a pained gasp, clutching Julian's ankle. He whined that it hurt. Julian told him he was surprised it didn't kill him, exasperated by his audacity. Caleb kept his head bowed, projecting an image of contrite obedience he had perfected over a lifetime. Raised by Julian after their parents' death, he had learned early how to navigate his brother's moods. He pressed his cheek against Julian's leg, murmuring that he couldn't let him go through with any merger marriage. Julian extinguished his cigarette, pinching the bridge of his nose in frustration before kicking him away gently. He demanded to know why Caleb had returned from Los Angeles when he was supposed to be in training for his next race. Caleb couldn't admit he'd flown back the second he'd heard the rumors. Instead, he let his shoulders slump, his expression turning miserable. He confessed that he was having romantic troubles. This got Julian's attention. He straightened up, studying Caleb under the cool office lights. Caleb continued his performance, looking up at the man who had raised him. Julian, with his long lashes and lips still colored from the cigarette, was an achingly beautiful sight. Caleb confessed that he'd fallen for someone, but the feelings weren't returned. A heavy silence filled the room. Julian lit another cigarette, his fingers drumming an impatient rhythm on the table. After a long moment, a cynical smirk touched his lips. He told Caleb that if he wanted something, he should just take it, calling him a coward. Just take it. The simple, brutal advice cut through months of Caleb's agonizing indecision. He had never considered such a direct approach to confessing his feelings to Julian. Julian pressed on, asking if he was content to just be friends with this person, questioning if he was short on friends. Caleb nodded slowly, a new resolve hardening inside him. Julian was right. That evening, Caleb invited Julian to dinner. His brother arrived late from the office, looking drained, his suit jacket slung over his arm. He surveyed the opulent hotel suite with a questioning look, asking if this was where Caleb intended to treat him. Caleb confirmed it, and soon a cart laden with gourmet dishes and a bottle of top-shelf whiskey was wheeled in. Throughout the meal, Caleb diligently refilled Julian's glass. Halfway through dinner, Julian seemed to remember their earlier conversation, asking how the pursuit of Caleb's love interest was going. Caleb replied that it was happening right now. Julian's hand trembled, spilling a drop of amber liquid onto his skin. He suggested Caleb should go after dinner. Caleb simply repeated that he was already in the middle of it. Slightly drunk and slow on the uptake, Julian scanned the empty suite, asking where the person was. Caleb met his gaze and stated the obvious. Julian was the person. Took a long moment for the words to register. Julian shot to his feet, his eyes wide with disbelief, demanding Caleb repeat himself. Seeing the tremor in his brother's hands, Caleb stood and gently took one, pressing a kiss to the back of it, tasting the faint spice of spilled whiskey. His heart hammered against his ribs. As Julian tried to pull away, stunned, Caleb pressed his hand flat against his own chest, letting him feel the frantic, chaotic rhythm. He confessed his love for him. The declaration froze Julian in place. For a long moment, he was silent. Then, he began pacing the room like a caged animal, yanking at his tie, his composure shattering. He stammered that they were both men. Caleb calmly agreed. Julian insisted he didn't like men. Caleb countered that he wasn't interested in women either. He was only interested in Julian. He stood calmly, subtly blocking the exit, knowing Julian might bolt. He had a flight back to the States booked for the next morning. Tonight was his only chance. He had spent the entire day planning this, even researching techniques online to ensure his brother's first time would be a good experience. Julian, agitated and cornered, finally collapsed onto the sofa. He tried to reason with Caleb, telling him it was impossible. Caleb asked why, reminding him they weren't related by blood. His real brother had died in the same car accident as his parents. Julian was the son of his parents' benefactor, taken in to replace the brother he'd lost. At 15, Julian had shouldered the responsibility of raising a 10-year-old Caleb. For 14 years, they had been each other's entire world, the only two people who could sign medical consent forms for one another. He was the most important person in Caleb's life, and Caleb couldn't bear the thought of anyone else holding that place. Seeing his words had no effect, Julian's frustration boiled over. His fists clenched, veins standing out on his skin. He repeated that it was impossible. The flat rejection stung, and Caleb felt tears well up in his eyes. The sight of him crying seemed to stun Julian, silencing his protests. Caleb cried for a moment, then apologized. Then, in a swift, unexpected move, he hoisted a shocked Julian over his shoulder and carried him toward the bedroom. Though tall, Julian was slender, and Caleb, at 6'3" and built like an athlete, easily overpowered him. Julian struggled, shouting that he was an asshole. Caleb, turning his head to see the flush on his brother's face, kissed his cheek and agreed. Julian was usually so reserved, so in control. Caleb had rarely seen him lose his composure. Now, as Caleb pinned him down, Julian tried to evade his kiss, but Caleb held the back of his head, forcing the intimacy. Julian bit down hard, and the coppery taste of blood filled Caleb's mouth. He didn't pull away. He held Julian tighter, almost trying to merge their bodies into one, betting that his brother wouldn't have it in him to cause a serious injury. He was right. As the taste of blood intensified, Julian's jaw relaxed, and Caleb deepened the kiss, a possessive sweetness flooding his senses. By the end of it, Julian was pliant, his limbs weak as he gasped for air against Caleb's chest, his eyes glassy. He only started to resist again when Caleb's hands went to his belt. Caleb whispered for him to be good, to not move. When Julian continued to push him away, Caleb leaned in and gently suckled his earlobe. A deep blush spread from Julian's neck to his ears, and his struggles ceased. Caleb took the opportunity to use his tie to bind his hands to the headboard. The lights stayed on for a long time that night, and for most of it, Julian cursed him. Caleb moved against him, silencing his angry shouts with obsessive kisses. Towards the end, Julian fell silent, biting his lip to keep from making a sound. his eyes fixed on the ceiling, his body slick with sweat. He finally broke, his voice a hoarse whisper, pleading with him, trying to appeal to Caleb's conscience by reminding him that he was his brother. Caleb met his furious, tear-filled gaze and gently kissed his damp forehead. He knew, from the moment he realized he loved him, Julian could only ever be his. As dawn broke, Caleb carried a limp Julian to the bathroom. The warm water made him stir with a soft moan before he fell back into a deep sleep. Caleb held him in the tub, kissing the side of his neck, leaving marks to claim his territory. He was leaving for the States in a few hours, and a sense of loss already clawed at him, even with Julian in his arms. He needed more, something to soothe the burden that came with their impending separation. He looked down at Julian, who frowned even in his sleep. The softness in his sleeping face was intoxicating. After a moment, Caleb smoothed the frown from his brow, then his hand moved to his throat, tightening just enough to wake him. Julian whimpered a protest, his voice raspy. In the water, he was helpless, clinging to Caleb's arm as the kiss deepened, the water sloshing over the sides of the tub. The fantasy he had replayed in his mind for years was finally real. He held Julian tightly, cementing the feeling of his presence to fight off the loneliness that was to come. When Caleb woke up, Julian was already gone. He had to board his flight back to America for the race. Perhaps because his heart was finally settled, he dominated the season, finishing first in the overall point standings after 24 races. Congratulatory messages flooded his phone from friends and fans, but none from Julian. He tried calling, but there was no answer. At least he wasn't blocked. Upon his return to New York, fans mobbed him at the airport. In the past, Julian would have been there to pick him up, no matter how busy he was. This time, after 5 hours of signing autographs and taking pictures, there was still no sign of him. Caleb drove straight to the corporate headquarters. On the top floor, Julian's executive assistant, Mark, stopped him, stating firmly that Mr. Vance was busy and had no time to see him. As Mark stood his ground, Caleb could hear the faint sound of a woman's laughter coming from inside Julian's office. A dozen dark possibilities swirled in his mind, and a cold anger began to build. He shoved Mark aside and kicked open the door. A woman was lounging on Julian's sofa, on the phone. She hung up when she saw him, her expression shifting from surprise to confusion. She recognized him, calling him Caleb. He scanned the office for his brother, but Julian wasn't there. A bitter taste filled his mouth, and his voice was choked when he asked where his brother was. At the mention of Julian, the woman blushed. She told him Julian was in the shower. In that instant, Caleb's frantic heart felt like it had been plunged into ice water. He could hear the sound of the water running from the private bathroom. The woman noticed his expression, asking in alarm if he was all right and why he was crying as she offered him a tissue. He touched his cheek. It was wet. Just then, the shower stopped. Julian emerged in a bathrobe, his expression cold. Caleb's voice was a raw croak when he asked if Julian was abandoning him. The tears started again, harder this time. Julian's face tightened with irritation. He asked if Caleb could have some dignity, then instructed Mark to escort the woman out. As soon as they were alone, Caleb rushed forward and clung to his brother's legs, sobbing that he couldn't leave him, that Julian was all he had. The coldness in Julian's eyes softened at his last words. He patted Caleb's shoulder reassuringly, telling him they would always be brothers. Then, as if remembering, a faint red colored his ears. He told Caleb to consider what happened an accident, a mistake they could both move on from without affecting their relationship. He explained that the woman was his girlfriend, that he didn't like men, and that Caleb should. Before he could finish, Caleb chopped him sharply on the back of the neck, and Julian crumpled. When Mark returned, the office was empty. Miles away, Caleb was driving down a highway, Julian unconscious in the back seat, still wrapped in the bathrobe. The collar had fallen open, revealing the faint red marks and bite marks on his collarbone. souvenirs from their night together. Caleb refused to believe Julian had a girlfriend. Julian was too aloof, too distant. The only person he had ever been warm with was him. It had to be a lie. In a small cabin on a deserted island, Caleb held Julian's ankle while his brother cursed him. Julian had woken up and passed out several times before he finally gave in, begging for mercy. Caleb began his interrogation, asking if the woman was really his girlfriend. When Julian insisted she was, Caleb just continued. Finally, Julian broke, admitting through ragged breaths that it wasn't true, that he had lied. Satisfied, Caleb kissed his sweat-damp cheek, praising him. Julian, exhausted, asked where they were. Caleb told him they were on a deserted island. Julian's eyes widened in horror. He asked if Caleb planned to keep him here forever. Caleb said he just wanted an uninterrupted environment for them to cultivate their relationship. So Julian would only let him go if he fell in love with him? Yes. Julian closed his eyes and said then they would both die here. Caleb was overjoyed, asking if he was willing to grow old and die with him. The romantic wilderness trip did not get off to a good start. After a night's sleep, Julian was hungry. Caleb searched the cabin and produced a bag of rice. Julian looked utterly defeated. Caleb admitted he'd forgotten to bring anything else to cook. An hour later, he managed to build a fire and was attempting to grill a fish he'd caught. Julian took one bite of the charred offering and threw it into the bushes. He watched Caleb with a cold smirk and remarked on his excellent work. Caleb didn't dare respond, focusing intently on the second fish, praying it wouldn't burn. Julian asked how he had even gotten him here. Caleb explained it was a combination of car, helicopter, and then a yacht. Julian clapped his hands slowly, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He noted that all the money he'd worked so hard to earn to send Caleb to learn these hobbies was now being used against him. That night, Julian ate only a little of the watery rice porridge Caleb had accidentally made instead of steamed rice. When Caleb tried to cuddle with him in bed, he was met with a sharp slap across the face. After Julian fell asleep, Caleb spent hours searching the island by flashlight, gathering mushrooms. The next morning, he made a mushroom and fish porridge. The earthy flavor made it more palatable, and Julian, probably out of sheer hunger, ate a full bowl. Afterwards, he lay sunbathing on the yacht's deck. Caleb watched him, his throat tight. The new marks on his brother's pale skin were a beautiful, chaotic masterpiece. He was supposed to be massaging Julian's legs, but his hands began to wander. Later, as Julian clung to him, slick with sweat, he suddenly opened his eyes and stared at Caleb, a strange look on his face. He asked if Caleb was a fox spirit, because he could have sworn he saw a fluffy tail and ears on his head. Caleb froze. Julian went on, marveling at a fish that was walking on its fins nearby. Caleb glanced at the leftover mushroom porridge. He'd given most of it to Julian and had only eaten the grilled fish himself. As Julian began having conversations with various sea creatures, Caleb let out a strangled cry, jumped off the deck, and gunned the yacht's engine, racing back towards civilization. As soon as he got a signal, he called for an ambulance. The doctor later explained it was a mild case of hallucinogenic mushroom poisoning. Their first romantic getaway came to an abrupt end. Back in New York, Julian blocked him completely and changed the security codes to his penthouse. After a week of failed attempts to see him, Caleb climbed up the fire escape and slipped in through the second-floor balcony. He found Julian sleeping soundly and slid into bed beside him, wrapping his arms around his warm body. Julian woke with a start, kicked him once, but Caleb caught his foot. Too tired to fight, Julian fell back asleep. Caleb, running on fumes after days of sleeplessness, held him and finally slept. The next morning, Julian was gone, and his name was trending on social media alongside a popular actress named Lindsay Clark, the same woman from his office. A video showed her coyly telling reporters that she and Julian were just friends. The internet was buzzing with rumors that they were secretly dating. Enraged, Caleb stormed into the office building again. Julian was in a meeting, He saw Caleb, his brow furrowed, but Caleb waited in his office as instructed. The first thing he noticed was that the sofa had been replaced. His mind raced with jealous possibilities. He called his friend Chloe and told her to cancel Lindsay's endorsement deal with their parent company and terminate her contract. Chloe, ever reliable, agreed. That evening, Caleb ambushed Julian's car on a quiet, camera-free street and forced him into his own vehicle. He ignored Julian's stream of curses, switching cars several times to lose any tails, and drove for hours until they reached another remote cabin, this one deep in a national forest. The moment Caleb untied him, Julian slapped him hard across the face. Caleb just grinned, licked the inside of his cheek, and offered him the other side. Julian's hand froze mid-air, defeated. This time, Caleb was prepared. He proudly displayed a cabinet stocked with self-heating meals, instant pot roast, and ramen of every flavor. Julian stared at the provisions, then slapped his own face in despair. Caleb rushed to his side, telling him not to hurt himself, to hit him instead. Julian ground out a single word: leave. Less than a week later, as Caleb offered him a choice between Kung Pao chicken and beef stroganoff MREs, Julian finally snapped. He swept everything onto the floor, his voice cracking as he shouted that he'd rather die than eat another instant meal. He threatened to kill himself if Caleb didn't take him back. Heartbroken, Caleb drove him back to the city. On the way out of the wilderness, they passed a roadside barbecue shack. Julian, who normally disdained such places, sat on a greasy stool and devoured $200 worth of ribs and brisket, weeping with joy and declaring it better than any Michelin-starred restaurant. Back in the city, Julian was gone, disappeared. He'd gone to ground. Caleb found him through his friend Leo, who had people track Julian's assistant, Mark. Julian was holed up in a mountain villa with heavy security. Convinced Julian had a secret, a good reason for pushing him away, Caleb devised a new plan. He found Julian's contact information on an old payment app and sent a simple message: "Bro, help me." Then he swallowed several pills from a vial he'd acquired. When Julian burst into the hotel room he'd tracked Caleb to, he found him collapsed on the floor, convulsing, whispering his name. Sweat poured down his face, his clothes were torn, but his hair was still perfectly styled. He looked up, his eyes bloodshot with a mixture of pain, desire, and tears. He told Julian he felt like he was dying, and begged for his help. Julian stood frozen, Mark behind him. Caleb began to crawl towards him, his breath coming in hot gasps. Julian finally sighed, told Mark to investigate, and lifted Caleb from the floor. As Mark left, Caleb shot him a triumphant smirk over Julian's shoulder. He begged Julian not to take him to a hospital, claiming he would die before they got there. He pressed himself against his brother, the drug intensifying his reactions. Julian watched him for a long moment. Then, with a soft, resigned sigh, he leaned in. His hands trembled as they went to the buttons of Caleb's shirt. Caleb wrapped his arms around Julian's waist, pulling him close. That night, Julian cursed him again, and Caleb simply answered by whispering in his ear how much he'd missed him. The next morning, Caleb woke up first. He held Julian, marveling at his good fortune. When Julian woke that afternoon, he tried to get out of bed, but his legs gave out and he sank to the floor. Caleb dutifully carried him to the bathroom. Seeing the fresh marks all over his body in the mirror, Julian hissed, asking if he was part dog. The bathroom door slammed shut in Caleb's face. When he emerged, Caleb clung to him, refusing to let go. He told Julian he knew he was hiding something, and that he could help, but he would not be abandoned again. He threatened to investigate on his own, to put himself in danger, if Julian pushed him away. That did it. Julian sternly forbade him from doing anything reckless. Caleb promised to be good. On the drive to the mountain villa, Caleb admitted he'd had Mark followed. Julian pushed him away when he tried to kiss him at a red light, insisting he hadn't agreed to anything. As they turned onto the main highway, Julian's expression suddenly changed. He realized that if Caleb could find him, so could others. Just as he said it, a convoy of black SUVs appeared in the rearview mirror, accelerating toward them. Julian's face was grim. He made a quick call, his voice low and urgent. He explained that his grandfather was dying, and he had to return to the family estate. His uncles, fearing he would inherit everything, were trying to kill him. So this was his secret. Julian Montgomery, as Caleb now knew was his real name, turned to him, his gaze intense. He asked Caleb if he could lose them. Caleb's playful demeanor vanished. He gripped the steering wheel, flooring the accelerator. This was more intense than any race. Julian's life was in his hands. Dozens of cars swarmed them, trying to box them in. Caleb didn't slow down. He drove head-on towards a blockade, then at the last possible second, swerved violently, driving the McLaren up onto two wheels and squeezing through a narrow gap as the pursuing cars crashed behind them in a screech of metal and tires. At the end of a long tunnel, Mark was waiting with a motorcycle. Caleb told Julian to take it and head for the estate while he and Mark drew their fire. Julian refused, saying it was too dangerous. Caleb looked him dead in the eye and told him to go do what he had to do, calling him by his real name for the first time. Julian. That single word conveyed the gravity of the situation. As Julian mounted the bike, he paused, shouting over the engine's roar that Caleb had to be careful, because they would kill him. When Caleb asked why, Julian yelled back as he sped away, because they knew he was Julian's weakness. The words echoed in Caleb's chest. He was his weakness. He turned to Mark, a giddy smile on his face. He was loved, hopelessly loved. As the convoy reappeared behind them, he and Mark led them on a wild chase through the mountains. Mark finally filled in the rest of the story. Julian was the heir to the Montgomery fortune, an old and powerful family. His parents were murdered by his uncles. Caleb's parents, who were friends of the family, saved the young Julian but were killed in retaliation, along with their own son, Caleb's biological brother, who was mistaken for Julian. The guilt had haunted Julian his entire life, fueling his devotion and tolerance for Caleb's behavior. It wasn't just compensation. As Caleb told a stunned Mark, it was because he loved him. After another death-defying maneuver that involved jumping the car over a river, they met up with their friend Leo, who was waiting in a flashy Ferrari. Caleb took over, leaving Mark and his own battered car behind. He raced towards the Montgomery estate, Julian arriving on the motorcycle at the same time. Their friend Chloe had arranged a diversion. A tanker truck conveniently overturned at the main gate, spilling its foul contents and forcing the gates open for cleanup, creating a media frenzy about a supposed celebrity sighting nearby. Caleb drove the Ferrari straight through the chaos, screeching to a halt in front of the main house, where the entire clan was gathered in black, feigning grief while they waited for the old man to die. When bodyguards moved to intercept Julian, Caleb revved the engine, shouting that he'd run down every last one of them if they touched him. He was just one life. They were all powerful heirs. They backed down. Just as the tension reached its peak, the curtains on the second floor were thrown open. A moment later, the uncles waved them through. Julian walked toward the house, Caleb's car crawling right behind him like a loyal guard dog. He pushed open the doors to find his grandfather, not on his deathbed, but sitting in a wheelchair, looking hale and sharp. The old man told him he had returned, that he had passed all the tests. The entire succession drama, the danger, it had all been a final, brutal crucible orchestrated by his grandfather to forge a worthy heir. Pushing the wheelchair out onto the veranda, the old patriarch announced to his stunned family that Julian, and only Julian, would be his successor. Across the crowd, Julian and Caleb's eyes met. In that moment, Caleb understood the complex storm of triumph, grief, and relief swirling inside the man he loved. The old man looked from his grandson to Caleb and back again, a long, weary sigh escaping his lips. He simply said, "So be it." In the months that followed, Julian Montgomery reclaimed his name and his empire, dismantling his uncle's power bases with ruthless efficiency. One afternoon, Caleb showed up at the estate and pulled him away. By a secluded lake, he parked the car and turned to Julian, his voice thick with emotion. He complained that it had been 3 days, 6 hours, and 4,680 minutes since they'd last seen each other, and he was dying from the separation. He pressed Julian's hand to his chest and felt his brother's cheeks flush. Just then, a call came through from Mark. Startled, Julian lurched forward, accidentally honking the horn. Caleb answered the call while continuing his administrations, reducing Julian to breathless, unsteady replies before the line went silent. Later, lying in his arms, Julian asked what would become of the company Caleb now owned. Caleb told him to manage it. The company and Caleb himself were all his. He just wanted to be a kept man. Julian retorted that he was better suited to being a servant. Caleb corrected him, he was his husband. And if Julian wouldn't marry him, he'd just have to marry Julian. He'd make a great sister-in-law to himself.